Hello, welcome to Holding Ground, a show that tackles topics in mental health and psychotherapy for individuals, couples, children, and families. Our goal is to promote well-being by normalizing mental health challenges. I'm your host, Laura Richer, a psychotherapist and the founder of Anchor Light Therapy Collective in Seattle, Washington. For more tips and resources on mental health, visit anchorlighttherapy.com or follow us on socials at Anchor Light Therapy.
Welcome to Holding Ground, your trusted resource for psychotherapy and mental health insights. I'm Ashlyn Graff, a clinical supervisor here at Anchor Light Therapy, and in today's episode, I am joined by Sarah Stewart to dive into the topic of feminism in therapy.
Hi Ashlyn, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.
I love this topic and I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you today. But before we do, just tell me a little bit about what it was that inspired you to think a little bit more about feminism in your therapy practice.
Yeah, I think about when the Barbie movie came out and there was America Ferrera's kind of like really iconic monologue where she is talking about how as a woman with all these like societal expectations, it is kind of just feeling impossible to please everyone. So that's one thing that really kind of brought it up. I think there's so many strong women that like we see in our therapy practice that don't realize how amazing they are and these expectations really weigh on them. So yeah, that's kind of what brought me here today. Can you tell us a little bit about feminist theory in therapy?
Absolutely. I love that monologue. It really, in the picture that it paints and the words it puts to the way we feel about feminism and being a woman in the world. And when I think about feminism, I really think of it as a movement to balance the scales of equality and rights for all women, not just in theory, but also in practice and across race, sexual orientation, class, all of the above. So it's really getting at that inclusivity, and that inclusivity really matters because especially for those women who are already marginalized and oppressed, those imbalances can exacerbate the stressors and the challenges that they face that feel unfair. And in therapy, in the therapy room, feminist theory tends to show up as a lens that we as therapists will apply and use to help us understand a client's struggles, not only in terms of their personal history and experiences, but also how larger systems and cultural expectations, interact and have shaped who they are and how they experience the world. And so really naming those outside pressures in the room and, sometimes reframing clients' situation from individual problems to more of an environmental and systemic problem, and also a natural response to just inequity and unrealistic expectations.
I think that's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, we often see it come up in sneaky ways, the shoulds in the small kind of minutia of the conversation that we have with clients. We'll hear it expressed as expectations, like I said, should, or how they believe they're expected to be seen and what they believe is possible for their lives and for their relationships.
Yeah.
It's tough. What kind of expectations do you often hear from clients about how they receive the world?
Yeah, we hear a lot of them. I think one thing that stands out is like in professional settings, there may be like expectations to like be perfect or perform higher than maybe like male counterparts perform, and fears of like if I don't work twice as hard as my job, gonna be at risk, or maybe in healthcare settings where if I am expressing something, am I going to be heard? Are my concerns going to be seen as valid? In academia is kind of similar too, about like I just need to achieve everything and I can't have any like need for help or support. So like those are all actually more common than I would like to be able to say that they are in terms of what we hear from clients. What about for you in terms of those expectations and pressures you hear about?
I definitely echo the presence of that perfectionism and that need to kind of take on that responsibility to be perfect and keep all that together and moving, taking that on themselves. But I've also noticed, in addition, women end up carrying a lot of the caregiving roles in romantic relationships, in in friendships, in family life especially, and often it really comes out in invisible mental labor. So, I know that's a big buzzword right now, the mental labor of being the organizer and the planner, even if somebody else might execute a task or some form of support. It often falls on the woman to do that caregiving. And we see this also younger in childhood. From a young age, girls tend to get pushed into that role if they're parentified, if parents are not kind of taking on that role and when they're younger, and they have younger siblings to care for, that they kind of end up being expected to step into that role, whereas their male counterparts, young boys, often are parentified by stepping into a more man of the house kind of role and a provider type of position there.
So it looks a little bit different.
Definitely, and for women also, we tend to see people pleasing, peacekeeping, and taking on kind of the responsibility of keeping everything under control and moving is something that definitely learns in childhood and typically follows into adulthood in different ways.
Yeah. You use the word parentified, and I also think about like the expectations, like as a parent on women. Like we hear so many moms discussing like fear of judgment from like other moms or teachers or their kids' doctors of like, am I being a good parent? Am I doing the right thing? Am I packing the right lunch for my kid? And especially with people who care so much. So that idea about just like the right way to do things without understanding of like the individualized context that each kind of family has, and this like just fear from people who are deeply loving parents is something I feel like we see a lot. And there's also like this almost overcorrection, I feel like, in the modern era too, of like the pressure to be the perfect mom, that maybe dads don't feel in the same way just because of this judgment. And then that brings like the pressure of being a parent at all, in terms of like some women are expected to have kids or to want kids, and not everybody does as well. So I think that's another piece of it.
So many expectations to be held and managed at once, and that can make it really exhausting, as we talked about, the people pleasing too, and I know it comes up in that Barmy monologue about keeping that it feels impossible to please everybody. That definitely resonates. I also hear that in families there is that culture that you just touched on.
Yeah.
There is an individualized context in each family. There are norms that get perpetuated, expectations that get set around ways that women and girls should behave, right? Quote unquote. And it might be being told to be the good daughter, helping to keep the family together, don't make waves, don't just disturb things, and it could be a pressure to succeed in school and certain career paths that maybe male counterparts aren't encouraged in the same way, and eventually prioritize marriage and motherhood, and those messages start from an early age, and also can excuse me, those messages start from an early age and are also passed on from generations. Different women have different role models in their family that they learn from, and that can really have a strong impact on the way that they see their own connection to their femininity and their womanhood.
Yeah, totally. And like the religious and cultural beliefs from those individual families, like those can also reinforce those expectations. So like that might be around like, is a woman's role to be obedient, to like be pure? What are the faith practices? Are women allowed to be sexual, or is there shame for dating or judgment for dating? Or are they told to hide parts of themselves? I think on the opposite end, like there are some family systems that also have really like strong roles for women, and that idea of like the matriarchs, or the women who like really carry their families. So it goes on both ends, but for partners there might also be those added expectations around like their partners saying, how do we handle conflict? How do we parent? Maybe like expecting their partners to speak more from like a logical perspective than an emotional one. So there's definitely a bunch of different ways where we see those things too.
Definitely, it reminds me kind of the locus of control, right? And trying to kind of dictate what the voices that encourage and dictate the way women should or shouldn't behave, and whether it's coming from a place of control or a culture of celebration and appreciation and strength.
Yeah.
We've talked about expectations from families and partners. But one area we haven't touched on yet is the pressure women sometimes put on each other. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think we often really impose and maybe project our own expectations of ourselves onto others. And so that can also show up as silent or not so silent judgment on other women without a lot of understanding or empathy. I think about this like Brene Brown talk where she discussed this idea that like women can also kind of perpetuate some of the non-feminist values in their expectations of men to like be strong, to have a strong sex drive, to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So like it's not necessarily always just women on each other either. I think the clients that we see might also discuss expectations of like maybe what they should look like, what their bodies should be like, how much they should eat or exercise, with beauty standards kind of set by society or media, and just kind of those narrow definitions of what attractive means. So those are a few kind of like things that come up there. That kind of brings me to wanting to talk on like sex and sexuality and feminist expectations, discussions in feminism around those topics too. Can you touch on that?
Expectations around sex and sexuality for women can come from all different directions. Women are often told to be modest, to protect themselves, to avoid sex before marriage, and often face judgment if they don't follow those quote-unquote rules and abide by the norms of those cultures that might be perpetuating those expectations. Often from men and from partners, there can be a pressure that women might experience to be sexual or to people please in a way that prioritizes someone else's desires before theirs. In relationships, sometimes women tend to be blamed and seen as the problem if their sex drive doesn't match their partner's. And the pressure or responsibility is put on them to make up that difference or to be the one to change and abandon themselves in that way. And then across society, we see double standards when it comes to this often. Male sexuality tends to be a lot more widely accepted, talked about openly, while women are judged more harshly for the exact same behaviors.
Yeah, that definitely tracks with some of what I hear down in sessions too.
So given all these cultural norms and expectations that we've addressed today, how does culture shape these norms, and why do you think they're so deeply ingrained in our society? How do we get here?
Yeah, I mean, like when we look at like American history and attitudes towards women, we think about like women's rights movements. So like not that long ago, women were viewed as property. We did not have rights to vote. We did not have access to safe and legal reproductive health care. We were often silenced or steamrolled. So while there have been really amazing strides towards equality, in American culture, there are still areas where like maybe we do see inequality or like where some of those old narratives kind of still come up, even though, yeah, it's a little different now. I also think about the history of women in mental health settings. So like really being institutionalized in like psych wards for hysteria when it was maybe just somebody having emotions at all. And so like we still kind of see folks saying like, oh, she's so emotional or she has all these responses. Exactly. So some of those attitudes are still kind of there. Do you have thoughts about this as well?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up because it's something I do really enjoy working with clients about in the therapy space. It's really valuable to explore and look at how women were expected to show up both in their culture and their own family system, and what has that meant for them personally. Where do the traces of that, as you mentioned, also as similar to history, where it's a similar theme but it shows up differently then versus now. I find that to be true even on a smaller scale in the micro level with an individual. How these themes around feminism used to show up in their childhood might look different in adulthood, but they're really still kind of connected at the root. media is a huge part of our culture and society, one we cannot ignore. How do you feel like that reinforces or perpetuates some of these expectations too?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of media can be really sexualized. It might focus on like those like thin rather than realistic and diverse body types. Also, like the femininity that they're selling is a little bit more of a fantasy than a fantasy of it, rather than like this broad kind of encompassment of what it can mean to be a woman or be femme or female in any capacity. So like the ideas that health is a motivator are also really just inaccurate to like what it means to be healthy, and that's something that kind of sticks out too. I'm curious how you feel like family systems might also ingrain some of those like just expectations around body.
Absolutely. Women's role models, I would say, are probably what sticks out to me most in addition to media and kind of the culture at large. Role models within the home have a really strong impact. Those who grow up seeing strong, self-advocating women may have a very different experience than those who saw women either being put down, ignored, abused, or putting themselves down as well, especially as it relates to body, how they maybe internalize those expectations from society. Did you have a mom or a sister that internalized those societal expectations and criticisms? Did you have somebody that pushed against that and that was the role model? It's also how women are treated in the family system, how we see another parent treat a woman in the family, how men in family treat women in family, can definitely show up in how somebody relates to the world and those other gender roles as in other settings and in other parts of their life. So even in small things is just how a mom talks about herself, her sexuality, her body, other women, as well as how a dad or another parent, a sibling might also speak about women's sexuality, can really leave a lasting impression. Our nuclear family is so important to us that it really signals to us that this is an important message that we're being taught and can stick for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely second that. I feel like I see and hear that so much in like the EMDR kind of trauma therapy piece of things of like, where did those messages start when we're looking at the timeline and people are like, oh yeah, when I heard my mom call herself fat, or like when I heard mom saying that she needed to go on a diet or something along those lines. So not to go to that place of blaming the mom again, but like I think that idea that like our parents really are our first role models like is true.
Of course, and that speaks to the pervasiveness of these messages that it really does get so deep seated that we might not even recognize that we're having this form of self-talk or the influence that some of those experiences have until we slow down in moments like EMDR work.
First step that like we can take in shifting that narrative is by really recognizing the impact of judgment, both like on ourselves and others. I mean, it can be valid and helpful. We use our judgment to make good decisions and guide us in life. But like we also really use judgment to imply shortcomings or detriments to ourselves and others. And I think that's really when it can start to have those like harmful effects. It really feeds into that America Ferrera narrative of like, we're never gonna be enough, and no matter how hard we try, we cannot like do things that help the world or please everybody. And that just isn't necessarily healthy. So like that harsh self-judgment or the internalized judgment of others, it can lead to anxiety, it can lead to depression, worsening mental health symptoms. So even just knowing when we're doing that is a good starting point. Because like when we set these unattainable standards for ourselves, we're not really setting ourselves up for success.
Absolutely. There's when the standards feel so unrealistic, like you said, in satisfying everybody and being this perfect woman, there's only kind of that harsh judgment and criticism that tends to follow. And so I find that the antidote to some of that judgment can be, one antidote being empowerment.
Yeah.
Something that we definitely work on in therapy. And when I say empowerment, what I'm referring to is the act of supporting your own autonomy and self-determination, self-efficacy, is what I think of with empowerment, and really just helping people to feel capable and in control of their own lives, stepping into their power. And that looks different for everybody because it's really meant to be centered on each person's unique goals and values and strengths and worldviews. And so you can create, empowerment is meant to be created intentionally.
Yeah.
And then as more people are intentional and live a life of culture of empowerment, makes it easier to lift others up and engage in celebrating growth and actively supporting people stepping into their own power, which I love, that kind of idea of starting from within but also spreading, that it's contagious.
Yeah. I also like that idea of like really kind of sitting with and visualizing that empowerment. So like we live in a world where life goals can have such like a broad range between having kids, not having kids, having a career, traveling, having deep, healthy community and friendships. So really thinking that all of these things are valid to want or not want, and really imagining what that looks like for our clients or us in those like individual domains of life. Really asking yourself like, what can it take to get there? What are achievable steps I can take to move towards those goals of lifting myself up or lifting others up?
Yeah, visualizing helps to really make that come to life. Something that I exercise in my practice when working on empowerment and using feminism in therapy is around cognitive behavioral therapy. And so how that can be applicable is it can help clients to spot and reframe unhelpful core beliefs. So those judgments you were referring to they stick around, and they can sometimes show up as cognitive distortions as well. You know, things that we tell ourselves that might be disproportionate from what is really happening, and looking at those patterns, as you said, kind of as part of the visualization. A lot of it is noticing and becoming aware of where those patterns come up and the thinking that keeps us stuck. And as we've noted, those come from the messages and expectations that we've received for our whole lives. And you know, the self-talk is really key because we're receiving these messages from external sources, but what we can control is strengthening that message from within. And so cognitive restructuring, a part of CBT, allows women to start changing the way that they talk to themselves. And as we noted, the change begins within, from within. It really shows how when we feel confident and validated internally, it naturally expands to how we show up in the world and others, and tends to make that internal voice louder and makes the external voices, drowns them out a little bit.
That totally makes sense. I might also touch on like EMDR as a process, because I think when some of those narratives are a little bit more rooted in like trauma, either within families or in other areas of life, EMDR is something that can really help reframe those narratives by processing some of the like stuck emotions that people might have when they are very hard to just reframe. So I think that this can be something that can really help women heal as well, from those like societal expectations or really heavy judgments.
Definitely, I love that combo that even when there's deeper emotional experiences and it feels bigger than just a thought to replace or reframe, that there's still space to go and process in an emotionally safe way and still feel that you can release yourself from that. And as we wrap up for today, I'd encourage our listeners to reflect and on what it means to you to be a woman. What characteristics do you associate with your own womanhood, and where have they come from? What feels good? What doesn't feel good? And you might be surprised by your answer. There is no right or wrong. It's really just what feels authentic to you, and that's what I love about womanhood, is it gets to be that. It's all about choice, and the choice is yours to make. Your version of womanhood is right when it's authentic to you.
Yeah. I might kind of close on a remark that I heard in a book that I really liked. The book was Eloquent Rage, and the author is Brittany Cooper. She wrote, one of feminism's biggest failures is its failure to insist that feminism is first and foremost about truly, deeply, and unapologetically loving women. That is the end of the quote. But I think it really goes towards that idea that a healthy love towards women is kind, it's compassionate, it offers healing, and it's non-judgmental, both for others and for ourselves.
I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that quote.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for meeting with me today.
Of course.
Thanks for tuning in to Holding Ground. For more tips and resources on mental health, visit anchorlighttherapy.com or follow us on socials at Anchorlight Therapy. This podcast is for the purpose of education only and is not a replacement for mental health treatment. We suggest you seek out the support of a trained professional for help with your specific situation. Stay tuned for more upcoming episodes.